It was a chilly afternoon in a small, bustling town where everyone seemed to know everyone. The kind of place where secrets rarely stayed hidden, and gossip traveled faster than the speed of light. Nestled on the corner of the main street was Marty's Diner, a popular eatery known for its classic menu and, unfortunately, the temperament of its manager, Greg. Greg was a man who ran his diner with an iron fist. He had rules, strict ones, and he made sure everyone knew them. If you didn't fit into his idea of who belonged, you weren't welcome. That day, as the bell above the door jingled, all eyes turned to the entrance. Standing there, framed by the light streaming in from outside, was a young soldier, his uniform pristine, his boots shining despite the mud-speckled streets outside. His name was David, Sergeant David Carter. He looked every bit the picture of discipline and pride, a man who had served his country with honor. But what made David stand out even more than his uniform was the fact that he was black. As David stepped inside, the conversations hushed, and an awkward silence filled the room. Some patrons glanced at him with respect, nodding subtly in acknowledgement of his service. Others, however, exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. Greg stood behind the counter, his expression unreadable, but his eyes narrowed as he watched David approach a booth near the window. David wasn't here to make a scene. He wasn't looking for attention. He had just returned to town after a grueling deployment overseas and was simply hoping for a quiet meal. A small slice of normalcy in a world that often felt anything but. He slid into the booth, picked up the menu, and began scanning it, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon making his stomach rumble. It wasn't long before a young waitress, Lisa, approached his table with a timid smile. Lisa had only been working at Marty's for a few weeks and was still finding her footing. "Welcome to Marty's Diner," she said softly, setting down a glass of water. "Can I get you something to drink to start?" Before David could answer, a loud voice cut through the diner. "Lisa, come here." It was Greg, his tone sharp and authoritative. Lisa froze, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, and quickly retreated to the counter. David watched the interaction, confused but trying to brush it off. He figured maybe it wasn't about him. At least that's what he hoped. Greg strode over to David's table, his boots thudding against the tiled floor with a deliberate weight. He crossed his arms and stood there, towering over David with a look that could curdle milk. "We don't serve this kind here," Greg said, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. The room seemed to freeze. Forks clattered onto plates, conversations died mid-sentence, and every pair of eyes darted between Greg and David. A heavy tension hung in the air, the kind that made people squirm in their seats, but too afraid to intervene. David blinked, stunned. For a moment, he thought he must have misheard. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice calm but firm. "You heard me," Greg snapped, his face twisted with disdain. "I don't care what kind of costume you're wearing. You're not welcome here." A wave of disbelief washed over David. He had faced prejudice before, both in and out of uniform, but the sheer audacity of Greg's words left him momentarily speechless. He could feel the stares of the other patrons boring into him, some sympathetic, others indifferent, a few even approving of Greg's words. But David wasn't the type to back down easily. He slowly stood up, his tall frame towering over Greg now, and looked him square in the eye. "I didn't come here for trouble," he said evenly. "I just wanted a meal." "Well, you're not getting one here," Greg retorted, pointing to the door. "So I suggest you take your little parade and march it right out of my diner." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. David glanced around, hoping, just hoping, that someone would speak up, that someone would say this wasn't right. But no one did. The weight of their silence was heavier than Greg's words. Taking a deep breath, David picked up his cap, placed it back on his head, and turned to leave. As he walked out the door, he could feel the sting of humiliation burning in his chest. But what Greg didn't know, what no one in that diner knew, was that David wasn't the type to let injustice slide. And as the bell jingled behind him, signaling his departure, a storm was brewing. Greg would soon learn that his actions had consequences, and sometimes Those consequences came from the most unexpected places. The cold air hit David's face as he stepped out of Marty's diner, but it wasn't enough to cool the heat rising in his chest. He clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides as he stared down the quiet street. The town looked the same as it always had. Small shops with hand-painted signs, the old barber shop on the corner, the faint sound of traffic in the distance, but it didn't feel the same. Not anymore. David had grown up here. This was his hometown. He used to ride his bike past this very diner as a kid, never imagining that one day, after serving his country, he'd be turned away like he didn't belong. The uniform he wore, the very symbol of service and sacrifice, suddenly felt heavy on his shoulders. But David wasn't about to let Greg's ignorance define him. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. It had been a while since they talked, but if anyone would understand, it was Marcus. Marcus Evans had been David's best friend since high school. While David went into the military, Marcus stayed behind and built a small business, a local gym that had become a cornerstone for the community. Marcus picked up after the second ring. "Yo, David. Man, it's been forever. You back in town?" David's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "Yeah, I'm back. Just got in last night." "Man, that's great. We got to catch up. You at your mom's place." David hesitated. "Actually, I'm standing outside Marty's diner." There was a pause on the other end. "Marty's? What are you doing there?" David let out a humorless chuckle. "Trying to grab a bite." Greg kicked me out. Another pause, heavier this time. "Hold up." "What?" "Said he doesn't serve my kind." Right in front of everyone. Silence stretched between them. Then Marcus cursed under his breath. I knew Greg was a piece of work, but seriously, in uniform. Man, that's messed up. David rubbed his temple. "Yeah, it is." And nobody said a word. Not one person. Marcus's tone shifted. "Listen, don't let that slide. People like Greg think they can get away with this because folks stay quiet." David stared back at the diner through the glass window. Greg was already laughing with a few customers, like nothing had happened. "I'm not looking for trouble, Marcus." "Sometimes trouble finds you," Marcus replied. "But you don't have to handle this alone. Swing by the gym later. We'll talk." David nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see him. "Yeah, I'll be there." As David ended the call, he caught sight of someone watching him from across the street. An older man in a tan coat, leaning against a lamppost, eyes narrowed. David glanced at him briefly, but the man quickly turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Strange, David thought, but he let it go for now. He made his way back to his truck, his mind turning over the events at the diner. This wasn't just about Greg anymore. This was about the kind of quiet hatred that lived in plain sight. And the more David thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just his fight. Meanwhile, back inside Marty's diner, Greg wiped down the counter with a smug grin. A few regulars chuckled quietly, nodding in approval. To Greg, what he did wasn't wrong. It was just business as usual. He leaned over to one of the older men at the counter. "You see that? Can't let them think they can just walk in here and do what they want." The man grunted in agreement, but not everyone shared Greg's satisfaction. Lisa, the young waitress, stood near the kitchen doors, her stomach twisted in knots. She had seen the look on David's face, the quiet hurt, the disappointment. It wasn't right, and she knew it. But what could she do? Speak up and risk losing her job? Jobs weren't easy to come by in this town. And Greg had a reputation for making life miserable for anyone who crossed him. Still, the image of David's face wouldn't leave her mind. Later that afternoon, David pulled into Marcus's gym, the familiar sound of weights clanging and music thumping through the walls. He stepped inside, greeted by the familiar smell of sweat and rubber mats. Marcus was by the front desk, talking to a couple of members, but when he saw David, he waved them off. "Man, it's good to see you." Marcus pulled him into a quick hug. "But I wish it was under better circumstances." David smirked slightly. Yeah, me too. Marcus leaned against the counter. Listen, Greg's been running that diner like it's his own little kingdom for years. People don't say anything because they're scared of him. He's got friends in the right places. David raised an eyebrow. What kind of friends? Marcus's expression darkened. Let's just say Greg's cozy with some folks who like things to stay the way they've always been. Old money. Old ideas. David folded his arms. That explains a lot. Marcus leaned in closer. But here's the thing. This isn't the first time he's done something like this. People talk, but nothing ever happens. What if this time people actually saw it, heard it? David followed his friend's train of thought. You mean go public? Marcus nodded. Exactly. Social media, news outlets. If people knew a soldier was turned away because of his skin color, Greg couldn't hide behind his diner walls. David hesitated. I didn't come back to start a war, Marcus. Marcus held his gaze. Maybe not, but maybe this town needs one. David exhaled slowly. He wasn't a man who liked the spotlight, but Marcus had a point. Greg had gotten away with this for too long. Before David could respond, the gym door creaked open, and Lisa stepped inside, looking nervous. Hey, she said softly, dancing between them. I work at Marty's. David and Marcus exchanged a quick glance. I wanted to talk to you, Lisa continued, her voice shaky but determined. About what happened today. David nodded slowly. Go on. Lisa hesitated, biting her lip. I shouldn't be here. If Greg finds out, but I can't stay quiet. What he did wasn't right, and it's not the first time. I've seen him turn people away before. She paused, gathering her courage. I think people need to know who he really is. David studied her for a moment, recognizing the fear, but also the strength it took to come here. You're right, he said quietly. They do. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken, clouds rolling in as if mirroring the storm that was slowly brewing in town. What started as one man's ignorance was about to become something much bigger. And Greg had no idea what was coming. David sat quietly, leaning against the cold wall of Marcus's gym, deep in thought. Lisa sat across from him, nervously fidgeting with the sleeves of her uniform. Marcus paced back and forth, tension thick in the air. The small town outside continued moving as if nothing had happened, but inside that gym, something was shifting. Lisa finally broke the silence. I didn't come here to cause problems, but I overheard Greg talking to someone on the phone after you left. David leaned in. What did he say? Lisa hesitated, glancing at Marcus before answering. He sounded angry, said something about keeping the diner clean, and not letting this turn into a bigger issue. Then he mentioned calling someone named Carl. I don't know who that is, but it sounded serious. Marcus stopped pacing. Carl Benson. David looked at him. Who's that? Marcus sighed. Greg's buddy. Runs a few local businesses and has deep pockets. He's also got connections with the town council. If Greg's pulling him in, it means they're trying to cover this up before it spreads. David's jaw tightened. So this goes deeper than just Greg's prejudice. Marcus nodded. This town has always been like this, man. People smile to your face but keep doors closed behind you. Greg and Carl are part of that old guard. They've got influence, and they'll use it to shut this down. Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper. They could make things worse for me, for all of us. David's eyes softened as he looked at her. I won't let that happen. You took a risk coming here, and I won't let them hurt you for it. But even as he spoke the words, David knew this wouldn't be easy. Calling out Greg wasn't just about one man's ignorance anymore. It was about an entire system designed to keep people like David quiet. Marcus grabbed his phone. We need to get ahead of this. I know a guy, Janal. He runs a blog that covers local stories the news won't touch. If we tell him what happened, maybe we can put some pressure on Greg. David thought for a moment. No, not yet. We need proof. Greg's just going to deny it, and people will believe him over us. We need to show the town exactly who he is. Lisa perked up. There are cameras in the diner. One by the door, one behind the counter. They record everything. If we could get that footage. David's eyes narrowed. That's exactly what we need. Marcus shook his head. Hold on, man. Greg's not stupid. He's probably already deleted it. Lisa hesitated. Not right away. The system backs up overnight. If we act fast, it might still be there. David stood up. Then we need to move now. But just as the plan began forming, David's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Asterisk, watch yourself, soldier. This isn't your fight. Walk away. Asterisk. David stared at the message, feeling the weight of the words. Marcus glanced over. What is it? David showed him the text. Marcus's face darkened. They're already watching you. Lisa paled. How did they even get your number? David slipped the phone into his pocket. Doesn't matter. I'm not backing down. Meanwhile, across town, Greg stood in his office, gripping his phone tightly. Carl Benson sat across from him, sipping coffee like he didn't have a care in the world. You handled it poorly, Carl said flatly. Greg glared. What was I supposed to do? Let him sit there and make my customers uncomfortable. Carl chuckled, shaking his head. Your pride is going to cost us. If this blows up, it won't just be your diner on the line. You think investors want to be connected to this kind of mess? Greg paced, his mind racing. I just need this to go away. Carl leaned forward. Then make it go away. Find out who that kid's talking to. Shut them up. Quietly. Greg nodded slowly. I've got a few people I can call. Back at the gym, David, Marcus, and Lisa were finalizing their plan. Lisa would go back to the diner on her next shift and try to access the security system. Marcus would reach out to Jamal discreetly, just in case they needed to release information quickly. David, however, had something else on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about Greg anymore. Someone was watching him, and the text made it clear they were willing to do more than just send warnings. Later that night, David drove through the quiet streets, headlights cutting through the darkness. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the scene at the diner, Greg's smug face, the silence of the customers, and now the threats. He stopped at a red light, glancing in his rearview mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw a dark car a few blocks back, idling under a broken streetlight. But when he blinked, it was gone. David exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel. This was bigger than he thought, and it was far from over. The night air was heavy as David parked a block away from Marty's diner, his truck hidden in the shadows. The streets were quiet, the town swallowed in an uneasy stillness. He checked his phone again. No new messages. But the earlier threat still lingered in his mind. Whoever sent it wasn't bluffing. Lisa was already inside. Her shift had started an hour ago, and she promised to text as she got access to the security system. David hated waiting, but barging in would only make things worse. They needed the footage, and they needed to be smart. Across town, Marcus was pacing in his small office at the gym, his phone glued to his ear. Come on, Jamal, you said you'd help, Marcus said, frustration in his voice. Jamal's voice crackled on the line. I want a man, but this is sensitive. You're talking about accusing a well-known businessman of racism. That's a serious claim. I can't just run with it without proof. Marcus exhaled sharply. We're working on it. Liz is getting the footage. Once we have it, I need you to blow this up. I mean everywhere, social media, blogs, anything. There was a pause. All right, but be careful. Guys like Greg don't go down easy. Marcus hung up and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The walls felt like they were closing in, and deep down, he knew they were running out of time. Back at the diner, Lisa's hands trembled as she wiped down a table, her eyes darting toward the office door. Greg was in there, talking loudly on the phone, pacing back and forth. She caught bits and pieces of his conversation. I don't care how you do it, Carl. Just make sure this dies before it spreads. I'm not losing everything over some punk in a uniform. Lisa swallowed hard. She had to move fast. The office computer held the security footage, but the door was always locked. Unless... Greg's voice rose. I'll be back in 20. Keep things running. He stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. She glanced around. The diner was nearly empty, just a few late-night regulars hunched over their coffee. Moving quickly but calmly, she slipped behind the counter and tried the office door. Locked. But she had seen Greg carelessly toss his keys on the hook near the register more than once. Praying for a miracle, she checked. And there they were. Her hands shook as she fit the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing Greg's cluttered office. The computer sat on the desk, the monitor still on. She closed the door quietly behind her and sat down, navigating to the security files. Rows of dated footage filled the screen. She scanned through the timestamps, looking for the exact moment David had walked in. Then she found it, the clear image of David in uniform, the tense exchange with Greg, and most importantly, Greg's hateful words, clear as day. Lisa fumbled for a flash drive in the desk drawer, praying Greg wasn't smart enough to password protect the files. She slid it in and started copying the footage. Minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. Lisa's blood ran cold. Lisa, it was another waitress, Megan. Hate Greg told me to check the register. Lisa forced her voice to sound casual. Yeah, I'm just keying up in here. I'll be out in a sec. The silence stretched. Then Megan's footsteps retreated. The file finally finished copying. Lisa yanked the flash drive out, locked the door behind her, and slipped the keys back onto the hook. She plastered on a nervous smile as she walked past Megan. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Asterisk, asterisk, David. Asterisk, 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 you good asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk, Lisa. Asterisk, 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 I have it. Meet me out back in 5 asterisk. Lisa moved quickly, her steps light as she made her way to the back exit. She pushed open the heavy door, and David was there, waiting in the shadows. Tell you got it, David said, his voice low. Lisa handed him the flash drive. Everything. It's all on here. Relief washed over David for a brief second. But it didn't last. The sound of tires screeching cut through the quiet night. A black SUV rounded the corner and skidded to a stop near the alley. The doors flew open, and 2 men stepped out, their faces obscured by hoodies. David instinctively moved in front of Lisa. One of the men spoke, his voice sharp. Hand it over. David didn't move. Who sent you? The man smirked. Does it matter? Lisa's breathing quickened. David's mind raced. He couldn't fight these guys and protect Lisa at the same time. The second man took a step forward, pulling something from his pocket. David couldn't tell if it was a weapon or not. But before anything else could happen, headlights flooded the alley. Marcus's car screeched to a stop, the driver's door flying open. Marcus jumped out, holding up his phone. You really want to do this? Because I live right now. Thousands of people watching. The 2 men froze. Marcus wasn't Liv. His phone screen was black. But they didn't know that. A tense standoff filled the air. The first man hissed under his breath. This isn't over. They backed off, jumped into the SUV, and peeled off into the night. David exhaled slowly. Marcus lowered his phone, smirking. They bought it. David turned to Lisa. We need to move. Now. They piled into Marcus's car, the flash drive clenched tightly in David's hand. This is bigger than Greg now, David muttered. Marcus nodded, and we just lit the match. As they sped off into the night, none of them noticed the dark figure standing on a rooftop across the street, watching them disappear into the shadows. The car sped through the empty streets, the tires humming against the cold asphalt. David stared out the window, the flash drive gripped tightly in his hand. Every shadow felt like it was watching. Every turn of the road felt heavier. They had the evidence now, but something didn't sit right. Greg wouldn't have sent 2 men to intimidate them unless he was truly desperate, or unless he had something even bigger planned. Marcus broke the tense silence. We need to get this to Jamal now, before they try something else. David nodded, but his mind was already moving ahead. They're not going to stop Marcus. Greg knows we have this. And if Carl's involved, it's not just about a diner anymore. It's about keeping people like us quiet. Lisa, sitting in the back seat, leaned forward. Then why do I feel like we're missing something? Greg isn't smart enough to handle this on his own. Someone else is pulling the strings. Marcus glanced at David. She's right. Greg's a loudmouth, but Carl's calculated. And Carl wouldn't get involved unless there was something big to lose. David thought about it. Greg and Carl were protecting more than just a business. They were protecting a system. Then David's phone buzzed. A private number. He answered cautiously. "Hello." A familiar voice crackled through the line. "I told you to walk away, soldier. You didn't listen." David's grip tightened. "Who is this?" But the voice ignored the question. "You think you've won because you have some video. Greg was just a small piece. You don't know what you're up against." Before David could respond, the line went dead. David stared at the phone, unease creeping into his chest. Marcus glanced over. "Who was it?" David shook his head slowly. "Someone who isn't Greg. And they know exactly what we're doing." Marcus cursed under his breath. Lisa's eyes widened. What if the footage isn't enough? David turned, meeting her eyes. "Then we need more than evidence. We need to know what they're hiding." But before anyone could answer, Marcus slammed on the brakes. Standing in the middle of the road was Sheriff Daniels, his cruiser parked sideways, blocking the street. Red and blue lights flashed, bathing the road in color. David's stomach dropped. Daniels stepped out slowly, hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. Marcus muttered, "This can't be good." David signaled for everyone to stay calm. He stepped out of the car cautiously. "Evening, Sheriff," David called out, keeping his voice steady. Daniels didn't smile. "Step away from the vehicle, son." David raised his hands slightly. "We got somewhere to be. What's this about?" Daniels narrowed his eyes. "I heard you've been stirring up trouble, raking into businesses, threatening folks." Marcus leaned out the window. "That's a lie, and you know it." Daniel's gaze didn't shift. "You're all coming with me. Let's not make this difficult." David's mind raced. This wasn't a random stop. Daniels was in on it. Lisa whispered from the back seat, "If he takes us in, they'll get the footage." David knew she was right. He forced a calm breath. "Sheriff, with all due respect, you don't want to do this." Daniels smirked. "You don't know what I want." Before David could say another word, another vehicle approached, an expensive black car, slowing to a stop behind the cruiser. Carl Benson stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks like he had all the time in the world. David's fists clenched. Carl smiled coldly. "Evening, gentlemen." "Sheriff, I'll handle this." Daniels hesitated but nodded, stepping aside. Carl walked slowly toward David, stopping just a few feet away. "You've caused quite the mess, haven't you?" Carl's voice was calm, dangerous. "I could end this right now. One phone call. That evidence disappears. And you go back to being a ghost in this town." David didn't move. "You think scaring me will make me back down?" Carl's smile didn't falter. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm giving you a chance. This story dies tonight, or you'll wish it had." David stared him down. "Not this time." Carl's eyes darkened. "Then you've chosen the hard way." Suddenly, from the shadows, another figure emerged. It was the older man David had seen near the diner, the one watching him. But now, the man wasn't hiding. He spoke, his voice cutting through the cold night. "You should listen to him, Carl." because I have something you don't want anyone to see. Carl's face paled for the first time. David turned confused. Who are you? The man gave a thin smile. Let's just say I know what Carl's hiding. And it's a lot worse than what happened in that diner. Carl took a step back. You're making a mistake. The man shook his head. No, you did. Years ago. David's pulse quickened. There was more, much more. And now the game had completely changed. The cold night air seemed to thicken around them as David stared at the mysterious man. The man's calmness was unsettling, but the way Carl's confidence cracked spoke louder than any words. David's voice was low but steady. Who are you and what do you know? The man stepped forward, his eyes locked on Carl. Name's Richard Hayes. Used to be a contractor for the county. I handled infrastructure deals years back. But Carl here, he wasn't just running businesses. He was funneling public money into private projects, illegal ones. Carl's face darkened. You're digging your own grave, Richard. Richard smirked. That's rich coming from you. David's mind raced. This wasn't just about a racist diner manager anymore. This was about corruption on a scale no one in the town knew about. Richard continued. Greg's diner was part of it. Money laundering. They'd used it to clean dirty money from Carl's under-the-table deals. That's why they couldn't let your story get out. If the diner's exposed, everything unravels. Lisa gasped, her hand over her mouth. Marcus shook his head. So it was never about you being a soldier. It was about protecting their operation. David tightened his grip on the flash drive. And the footage from the diner, it proves Greg's discrimination, but it could also be the thread that pulls this entire scheme apart. Carl's calm demeanor shattered. Sheriff, arrest them. But Sheriff Daniels hesitated, his hand frozen near his holster. The doubt was there now creeping in. Richard took advantage of the moment. He pulled out a second flash drive from his coat pocket. This is the real evidence. Bank records, signed contracts, emails. All of it. Everything Carl's been hiding. Carl lunged forward, rage overtaking him, but David stepped in his path, blocking him. No more threats, David said firmly. Richard tossed the flash drive to David. Get this to the right people, and this whole town changes. But before David could react, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night air. Carl's eyes narrowed. You think that's your rescue? You've got it backward. I still have people in the department. 2 more patrol cars screeched onto the scene. Officers poured out, guns drawn. But it wasn't who Carl expected. Leading them was Deputy Morales, her badge glinting under the flashing lights. Drop it, Carl. Morales commanded. Carl froze. Morales, you don't know what you're doing. Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing, she snapped back. You've been hiding behind power for years. Not tonight. The officers closed in, cuffing Carl as he fumed with silent rage. Sheriff Daniels paled, realizing his authority was slipping. Morales turned to him coldly. Your badge. Now. Daniels hesitated, but the weight of the moment broke him. He slowly unpinned his badge and dropped it into Morales' hand. Greg, who had been watching from the shadows, made a run for it. But Marcus was faster. He tackled Greg to the ground, pinning him with ease. Not so tough now, huh? Marcus sneered. As Greg struggled, David handed the 2 flash drives to Morales. One has footage of Greg's racism. The other has evidence that Carl's been bleeding this town dry. Morales stared at the drives, then at David. You just blew this wide open. But David wasn't done yet. He turned to Richard. Why now? Why come forward tonight? Richard's eyes darkened. Because Carl wasn't working alone. And the man above him, he's still out there. David's stomach dropped. Who? Richard leaned in slightly. The mayor. A heavy silence fell over the group. Lisa gasped, and Marcus cursed under his breath. Richard nodded grimly. Mayor Grayson signed off on every shady deal. Carl was just his middleman. You've won this battle, but the war's bigger than you think. David's grip on the flash drive tightened. The fight wasn't over. But tonight, they had taken the first step in tearing down a system that had been untouchable for far too long.